Okay, so this is my presentation of Locards Exchange Principle and Personal Protective Equipment and how that relates to each other. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay. What is Locards Exchange Principle? So every contact leaves a trace. Basically, like if one or more things come into contact with each other, they're going to leave a trace on each other. So that's why it's really important to wear the protective equipment in order to stop the cross-contamination between various pieces of evidence. And then I just have a picture of Lockhart. Okay, so personal protective equipment, what is it? It includes gloves, booties, face masks, hairnets, overalls, and the tie-back suit. So, I mean, basically you're covered head to toe, no skin is showing, you can't really breathe or anything, just to help with the contamination of evidence, or to stop that. What are the uses? So as I already said, like it's limiting the contamination of evidence, protects the CSI from biohazard materials like blood, saliva, other biological fluids, semen would be one of them. Yeah. So Lockhart's exchange principle in relation to personal protective equipment. So booties, they basically just cover your shoes, and it's to prevent the transfer of trace evidence from the soles of the shoes, and they have to be properly thrown away, like once you leave the crime scene, and you also have to put on new ones every time you enter the crime scene, even if it's the same one, or if you're entering a new one. So an example was actually in the textbook. The detectives in the OJ case did not wear booties covering their shoes when they entered the first crime scene, and then when they left, they didn't change their shoes either, which is frankly is the least they could have done. And then they entered the next crime scene, so they more than likely had trace evidence on their shoes from the first crime scene and took it with them to the next, which contaminated the evidence. Okay, so gloves. They prevent the destruction of fingerprint evidence and touch DNA, and it protects the CSI from contact with biohazard materials. Again, this includes like blood, saliva, and again, semen if necessary. They have to be changed following the collection of each item of evidence, so similar to the booties, as if like you would change them upon entering a new, like the crime scene or leaving the crime scene. Gloves, collecting the evidence, you always have to change them. And then for my example, I said that wearing gloves protects any evidence collected from being contaminated with the CSI's fingerprints, which that would be physical evidence. And then without wearing gloves, their fingerprints could contaminate any evidence that they touch, even like so the murder weapon. Well, if you grab it with your bare hands, now your fingerprints are on it too. So that's contaminated. You can't necessarily use that in court now. The face mask. So the two pictures that I have is the full face mask and the face mask that just covers the nose and mouth. And its purpose is to stop DNA from being transmitted through saliva, sneezing, or coughing onto items of evidence that are at the crime scene. So if someone, say someone has like a cold or whatever, or maybe they don't, they just walk into the crime scene, they're not wearing their face mask, and they cough or sneeze, well, all of that, like, it just goes everywhere. It's not like your sneeze stays in one place. And even if it did, it would still contaminate whatever evidence it touches. Same with a cough, like whatever evidence it touches, that's contaminated because now your DNA is on it. So it's very important to wear those. I didn't mean to do that. Okay. The hairnet is to minimize the transfer of hair from the investigative personnel onto the crime scene. So if someone is prone to losing their hair, like just strands of it or fibers or whatever we want to call it, or they have dandruff and that falls out onto evidence, well, that evidence is contaminated. So it's really important to wear the hairnet to stop it from being contaminated. And that was one of my examples, like the dandruff on a CSI, like, and they enter the crime scene and they're wearing all the necessary protective gear. Well, since they're wearing the hairnet, all the dandruff that falls from their head is collected into the hairnet instead of going onto the evidence, so the evidence doesn't become contaminated. And then the last but not least is the Tyvek suit or overalls, whatever you want to call them. They protect against biohazard materials similar to literally all the other personal protective equipment that we've discussed. So again, it's blood, saliva, and then it's supposed to be worn at all times. So the purpose is also to cover up any skin that is being exposed, and it prevents contamination of evidence from the CSI. So like if you're wearing the bodysuit and you enter a crime scene, well, again, like your entire body's covered. So let's say any hair that's like on your arms, on your legs, it happens to fall from that, well, it's inside the bodysuit. It's not going to touch the evidence, so it's not going to become contaminated. And all of these personal protective equipments, like, because they're used to stop the contamination of evidence, that directly relates to Locards Exchange principle, because it's stopping two pieces of evidence, or well, two pieces of anything, but again, in this case, it would be evidence, from touching each other and then ultimately becoming contaminated. So it allows those pieces of evidence to not become contaminated because they're not touching each other. And so there's no trace evidence on something else from either the CSI or from a different piece of evidence, whatever you want to say. So everything is like protected and preserved correctly. And this is just my references. So I use the textbook, the online resources provided, and then also the forensic science regulator, which just further explained the uses of the personal protective equipment.